Alright, man, peace. So for many of you brothers who grew up watching the Chicago Bulls rise to prominence in the early 90s, you'll remember that many of their more notable players, especially on the first three-peat team, seemed to suffer from little brother syndrome. Oftentimes, they would seem resentful that so much credit was given to Jordan for their success. And of course, when he retired the first time in 1993, that gave many of their more prominent members, like Scottie Pippen, Horace Grant, B.J. Armstrong, an opportunity to shine. And they did so. That first season where Jordan was gone, they played every regular season game like it was Game 7 of the playoffs, and they were able to win 55 games. And on top of that, they had 3 members of their team go to the All-Star game. Scottie Pippen went, B.J. Armstrong went, and Horace Grant went. And of course, they flamed out in the second round of the playoffs against the Knicks with a very controversial call in Game 5 where Scottie Pippen allegedly fouled Hubert Davis, and the Bulls' arch nemesis at referee Hugh Hollins blew the whistle. Hugh Hollins was one of the worst referees in NBA history. And of course, they were out in the second round that year. Came back the next season in 94-95 without Horace Grant, and they were basically a 500 team until Jordan came back. He came back straight from baseball with no basketball conditioning and was able to lead them to a 13-4 record in their last 17 games. He was great in the first round against the Charlotte Hornets. In the second round, he was great in spurts against the Orlando Magic, but it just wasn't enough because Orlando was just way too talented. They were way too talented, and Jordan did not have enough help, to quote LeBron James, and he also did not have proper conditioning. Because I believe that if Jordan had basketball conditioning in the 95 playoffs, they would have beat Orlando there. It just probably would have been a 6 or 7 game series because Jordan himself blew about 3 of those games in the 95 playoffs against Orlando. Quiet as kept. He blew Game 1 when he got stripped by Nick Anderson. In Game 3, he scored something like 31 or 33 points in the first half in Chicago against Orlando, but he was so winded in the second half. His stamina was so not up to par that Orlando came back and won that game. They won Game 4, the Bulls did. They went to Orlando for Game 5, and Jordan had a high scoring game again, but Orlando was able to come back and defeat them. And then in Game 6, the Bulls had the lead down the stretch, and Jordan was visibly exhausted, and Orlando was able to come back and win again. And that's what galvanized him in the offseason, of course, to come back and lead the Bulls to a 72-10 record and sweep the Orlando Magic. And the reason why I bring all this up is because it was very obvious that in the interim, that little interregnum period where Jordan was gone, that Scottie Pippen realized that heavy is the head that wears the crown. But I still think that he bears some disdain towards Michael. Nothing malicious, but he still has it towards Jordan, because he believes that Jordan's shadow has led to him being marginalized as an all-time great player, which is what Scottie was. He was a very good to borderline great offensive player, especially in transition, and he may be the greatest defender at his position in NBA history. And I think that that's the main reason why he tends to waffle so much when he's asked these questions about comparing Jordan and LeBron. Because I think that when he looks at LeBron, he sees a lot of himself. A playmaker, a scorer. Except LeBron would pretty much be Scottie Pippen on steroids. That's why I say that LeBron is like a mix between Scottie Pippen and Karl Malone. But on the converse, he wants to give Jordan credit because Jordan is like an older brother. He loves Jordan, but he has a lot of resentment towards him because of what Jordan put him through his first 3 years in Chicago. Jordan was very tough on Pippen and his other Bulls teammates in that period. And I think that many of them still have not moved past a lot of the mental turmoil that Jordan put them through in practice and during games. So Scottie, at this point, is so exasperated by this question about Jordan versus LeBron that he's decided that he's going to choose an answer that will not offend anyone and will stop him from getting asked this question. He's decided that he's going to declare Wilt Chamberlain the greatest player in NBA history, and it's for the sole purpose of no longer being asked this question because he's realized he's put his foot in it, he stepped in it, and he's trying to get out of it. First he said LeBron, then he said Jordan, then he said LeBron, and then one of his real arch nemesis, that being Isaiah Thomas, has come out and decided to utilize LeBron as the vehicle to try to tear down Michael Jordan. And like every resentful little brother, his attitude is, I can come against Michael, but nobody else can. And I believe that there is some personal issues between Scottie Pippen and Isaiah Thomas. Why do I say that? Because back in the day, when I say back in the day, I mean maybe about a year or so ago, Stephen A. Smith relayed a story that he was told, he said, by an NBA legend, that during a playoff series in the late 80s, their team decided that they were going to trash talk a certain player on a team that they were going against in a playoff round by saying that they were sleeping with his girl. And I said to myself, who could it be that Stephen A. Smith was talking about that would say something like that? And Stephen A. Smith told the story, and he said that the player told him, who was an NBA legend, the player told him, look, we were trying to win a championship, so we were going to say whatever to break certain guys who we thought were mentally weak. And I said to myself, who is it that he could have been talking about? And this is just my belief, this is just my opinion, my deduction, that he was talking about Isaiah Thomas. And the player that they targeted, because they viewed him as being mentally weak, was most likely Scottie Pippen. Just my view. Because it would explain why Scottie to this day has such a vitriolic opinion of Isaiah Thomas. If you remember, when NBA TV did that documentary of the first Dream Team, Scottie Pippen went out of his way to talk about how much he could not stand Isaiah Thomas. And don't be confused, none of those players liked Isaiah Thomas or the Bad Boy Pistons. But Scottie was by far the most verbose about it. Jordan was just sitting back chilling. I'm sure that Isaiah Thomas is not one of his favorite people, but Scottie went out of his way to talk about it. So that's just me putting two and two together. Could I be wrong? Absolutely. But I remember when Stephen A. Smith told that story like yesterday. And I know for a fact that of all the most prominent players of the 1980s who won championships, the person that Stephen A. Smith is closest to is Isaiah Thomas. So that's just the conclusion that makes the most sense to me, and it would explain a lot. But anyway, Scottie here is going to talk about Wilt Chamberlain being his all-time greatest player, and of course I'm going to chime in.
There's really no comparison. Michael Jordan played in an era where the game was different. It was being refereed different than what LeBron is playing in.
Let me say this very quickly. Many people today like to compare LeBron James' stats against Michael Jordan's stats. When you look up stats, one of the key parameters that you have to utilize is the per 36 minutes parameter, because that's going to give you a greater understanding of which players are actually being the most productive stat-wise on offense and on defense. And I wish that they would create a metric where they could factor in the difference in pace of NBA basketball in the 1990s as opposed to today. Because you have to understand that you could lead the league in scoring as a team back in the 1990s at 100 points a game. By the mid to late 90s, if you were averaging 100 points a game as a team, you could lead the league in scoring as a team. Today, you have to average about 115, almost 120 to lead the NBA in scoring. So I would like to see a metric get created where they could factor in the difference in pace and overall scoring output before they just start talking about how, well, Michael averaged 30 a game in this playoff run and LeBron James is averaging 32 a game in this playoff run, where the defenses are totally different, the pace is totally different. Jordan did more with less than LeBron James does today. That's why you have the abundance of offensive riches by so many of these NBA players today. That's why everybody's getting triple doubles like nothing, because the pace is so much faster. The floor is so much more widespread because you have 5 shooters out there that it's easier for guards to rebound. And I don't think that people really understand that. It's almost like when people talk about what is the most lucrative movie ever, and people say Titanic or Avengers or whatever the most lucrative movie is. But when you equal it out for inflation, it's still gone with the wind. So I wish that people had a stat that we could equal things out and factor in inflation in regards to scoring, team scoring, so that we could truly see who's more productive numerically, Michael Jordan or LeBron James. Because I guarantee you that if you weighed Jordan's numbers for inflation, you could take his 32 a game back in 1996 playoffs or something like that, and today it would be something like 38 points a game.
LeBron plays a different role than what Michael played as a player. In all fairness to Michael, he was never asked to do the things that LeBron do for his.
Of course, because Michael Jordan played in a real offensive system where different players actually were allowed to have responsibilities. And Jordan took his role and he maximized it, as opposed to saying, I want to take everybody's role so I could take all the credit.
His team, he had a lesser role. One guy is considered a two guard and one guy is considered a small forward. And, they definitely are great in their era. They're both the greatest in their era. But to say who is the greatest...
It's so funny to me. LeBron James always talks about how he does not get the benefit of the doubt from the refs. Every time he drives to the basket, he lowers his shoulder like a bull in a china shop. They can literally call offensive foul on LeBron every time he drives, because if he's not lowering his shoulder, he's fending off the defender with his offhand.
We will never know that.
Scottie Pippen not hearing the comparisons of LeBron to MJ, adding Jordan was never asked to do the things that LeBron does for his team. Max?
Yes, and he also stated in that interview that Wilt Chamberlain is the greatest to him, which was his way of trying to bow out.
Max, does he have a point?
Yes, he does. He's right about that. That one point he's right about. Now, let me be very clear. Michael Jordan is the greatest basketball player of all time. I don't think it's a tough call. LeBron is great, but Michael Jordan's clearly the greatest to ever live.
Well, Michael's clearly the greatest player to ever play when in comparison to LeBron James. I think that there's a debate if we're going to talk about Bill Russell or Kareem, and maybe even Magic. But when it comes to LeBron, no.
Peak value, at the very least. And by the way, Stephen A., Jordan averaged, as you know, for his career, over 30 points, 6 boards, 5 assists, 2 steals, and almost a block. Averaged for his career, including when he was 40 and he was no good anymore, right?
Well, he was still good. He just wasn't transcendent.
Including when he was a rookie, averaged for his career.
Well, he actually had probably the greatest rookie season of any non-big in NBA history. Jordan came in as a rookie averaging 28 a game on 51% from the field.
So he did a whole lot. But in fact, Scottie's right, Stephen A. Michael was asked to do less. Phil Jackson took over the Bulls and asked Jordan to do less
Well, actually, Phil Jackson forced Jordan to do less, because Michael was so accustomed to having free reign over the offense under Doug Collins that there was a transitional period when Phil Jackson first was made the head coach of the Bulls in 1989, when he tried to implement the triangle offense, and Michael Jordan did not like it because it was meant to be a quote-unquote equal opportunity offense. And Jordan did not trust his teammates. It took him a year to learn how to trust his teammates. It really took him almost 2 years to learn that.
To let go of the reins a little bit, to trust his teammates. That's why they won so many championships. It's not that Jordan was incapable of doing more. He was asked to do less. And he was in an era, by the way, he averaged those incredible numbers, in an era where the primary ball handler, and he really was, he and Pippen, the point guard on that team was nominally a point guard. B.J. Armstrong, or whoever it was really a three-point shooter who could...
Yes, B.J. Armstrong is another player with little brother syndrome. I recently saw an interview with him where he was talking about how Michael had a different role from LeBron. Michael was a scorer, and at the end of the game, that's when he was par excellence, so on and so forth. A lot of these players are resentful for being known simply as one of the Jordanaires, which is what the Bulls were known as in the early 90s, basically as Michael Jordan's supporting cast, quote unquote.
Who could also play some defense, and Jordan had the ball in his hands at least as much as anyone else. So, but the primary ball handler in those days was asked to do less. The game was less about him than it is today, which is why Westbrook, Harden, everyone is putting up crazy numbers.
Agreed.
And yet Jordan put up those numbers anyway, but was asked to take his foot off the pedal, trust his teammates. Now, this is one of the reasons, Stephen A., why before we knew the extent of Kawhi's injury, or that it was as serious, at least as it appears, I said, hey, LeBron should go to San Antonio. Why did I say that? Because he's never played, due respect to Eric Spoelstra, who's a fine coach, but he's never played LeBron with the guy who's considered the greatest coach of his era.
Please understand that Phil Jackson was not considered the greatest coach of his era until Michael Jordan won those first 3 titles and then came back and won another 3. So this is why I make the point that we'll never know how great Eric Spoelstra actually is, because LeBron James was not there long enough to allow Eric Spoelstra to get the credit that he deserves.
The way Jordan did with Phil Jackson. You know, Doug Collins, respected coach, but Phil Jackson was just different. You know, Popovich, just different. And LeBron's never played with a guy like that. And as a result, again, respect to Eric Spoelstra, who's a good coach. As a result, oftentimes it's LeBron who's really the de facto coach.
Well, LeBron is the de facto coach on teams with weak coaches. I think that he struggled with Ty Lue to have control over the team. He was not allowed to have control over the team in Miami. That's why he had his most success there, because they actually made him conform to a degree while understanding that, okay, here's a player who needs to have dominance over the basketball. So we're going to intermingle the LeBron James system with the Miami Heat system. And that's what allowed him to have the energy to play so well on defense, because they did not allow him to do what he wants to do on offense.
Many seasons of his career. And so he does do more. It's one of the reasons he hasn't won as many championships, in spite of playing with a lot of all-star players. And that has a lot to do with coaching. It doesn't mean he's better than Jordan. In fact, Jordan's better than him. But Pippen's right about that. LeBron is asked to do more than Jordan was.
LeBron forces himself to do more than Michael Jordan was forced to do by himself. A lot of success in life is about outlook, is about understanding what exactly am I required to do, what am I able to do, and how do I try to synchronize those two things to make sure that I can optimize my output. Jordan was able to come to that happy medium. LeBron never has.
You know, I like Scottie Pippen. I don't enjoy having to say what I have to say. I'm not going to even get into the gibberish you just threw out there, Max Kellerman, because you're not the target of my ire at this particular moment in time. I just look at a guy like Scottie Pippen, and I'm like, I hate attaching agendas to what somebody says.
I understand that, brother, but sometimes we have to address what the motivations are of what people say so that we can get to the crux of the matter.
I believe that people have the right to feel what they feel without somebody thinking there's some kind of ulterior motive to their words. But in Scottie Pippen's case, I have to make an exception. What the hell is he talking about?
Very easy. It's very simple to know what Scottie Pippen is talking about, brother. We know what it is. Based off of what I introduced this video with, he's struggling within himself with his little brother syndrome. And when you're dealing with the little brother, for those of you who have younger brothers, you know that sometimes this issue happens. You have little sibling rivalries, you have little sibling jealousies, but they're also very protective if they feel like you're being attacked by someone outside of them. And that's what we have here with Scottie. Scottie is still resentful over the specter that Michael Jordan has hovering over himself. But he's not going to let anyone else attack that specter, only him. And he's just all over the place. One day LeBron's better than Michael. He's just saying that to get Michael's attention. Then Michael's better than LeBron. Then Scottie says, I'm better than LeBron. It's like, Scottie, don't worry about all that. Just worry about Future banging your wife.
Makes no sense whatsoever. We're talking about a man in Jordan. You threw out Max's regular season numbers. You forgot the postseason. In the 12 years that Michael Jordan was in the playoffs, he never averaged less than 30. Ever. One series he averaged 43. Another was 36. Another was 35. Another was 34. He never...
Hell, in the finals, the man had a finals where he averaged over 41 points a game against the Phoenix Suns.
Never averaged averaged less than 30. He's a career 48.7% shooter from the field. Now you look at Scottie Pippen, and you say to yourself, okay, you bring up the errors as if that's a knock against Jordan, when it is my belief that...
No, that's not what Scottie was saying at all. When Scottie stated that it was a different era when Jordan played, the reason why he said that the referees officiated the game differently, he was saying that it was far more physical and it was more difficult to score. That's what he was saying, Stephen A. Smith. He was not trying to downplay Jordan's era. Why would he do that when he played in the same era?
That is what elevates Jordan. We are living in an era, we are literally covering an era where you can get called for a foul for passing gas.
That was his point, brother. And I stated this in the comments in one of these sections, one of these videos that I did, where there was a brother who replied to someone else and he informed him that he was not listening properly. And I responded to that comment by stating that 90% of arguments that occur are due to listening comprehension. You'll find oftentimes that people are arguing or disputing with each other about issues that really don't even exist. It's just based off of people defaulting to emotionality and not opening up their ears or their eyes to make sure that they're fully ingesting what is actually being communicated. So Stephen A. Smith is taking the wrong tact with Scottie Pippen's words. The real issue is that Scottie's all over the place because he's dealing with his own inner turmoil and how he's viewed and what his legacy is. And he's never going to get his just due, especially if you never saw Scottie play. Scottie was so great as a complimentary player that he's considered a top 50 all-time great player. If there was a role player Hall of Fame, if there was a list of the greatest role players in NBA history, and there are many brothers who tried to dispute me when I say that Scottie was a role player. He was. Because he wasn't a star player. Or when I say star, I mean good enough to lead a team to a championship. Or be a viable lead guy on a championship run. If there was a role player Hall of Fame, he'd be right there with Kevin McHale and James Worthy and a lot of these other prominent players.
I mean, if the smell stink enough, you might get called for a foul. You got bad breath, you might get a technical. Don't get me started with the talking. And that's even before you get into the actual physical play that takes place. I gave you 3 categories before you even get into the physical play. This is the era LeBron is living in. Now, a 270-pound locomotive coming at you is playing in an era where you don't even have to touch him, and you might still get called for a foul.
A lot of that is overrated. The level of physicality in the NBA today is underrated. It's underrated. There is a lot of physicality in today's game. It's just that the game is played differently. It's more outside shooting. But all you have to do is watch the playoffs and you can see the physicality is still there. It's just that we're at the point now where a lot of brothers are hitting 45 years old, 50 years old, and they're trying to romanticize the time period that they grew up in, as opposed to understanding that the game really has not changed that much in regards to physicality in the playoffs. It really hasn't. Now, they don't let a lot of the out-of-bounds stuff carry on like they once did in generations past. When I say out-of-bounds stuff, I'm not talking about literally. I'm talking about clotheslines and stuff like that. Players getting submarined. But there are still hard fouls. And that's why I state that Scottie is really vouching for Michael Jordan, and he does not want to be asked this question anymore. He's more worried about his own legacy. Once again, if we were to create a hierarchy or a quote-unquote Hall of Fame for role players, Scottie's probably one of the top 5 role players in NBA history. Kevin McHale, Dennis Johnson, James Worthy, Joe Dumars. Like, these guys are all-time great role players to the point where they're in the actual NBA Hall of Fame because of their greatness.
But Jordan was playing against Boston with McHale and Bird and Parrish and those boys. And then after that, he had to go through the bad boy Pistons. And we know what the bad boys with Mahorn and Lambert and Sally and Rodman and James Edwards and Dumars and a rough rider like Isaiah Thomas, who was a little pit bull. He was CP3 before CP3 ever came along. And then after that, we go into the 90s, where you're going against the Knicks with Mason and Oakley and Ewan and these boys. You go against Indiana with the Davises and McSmiths and Reggie Miller and those boys. You go into the finals against Phoenix with Barkley. You go into the finals against Portland with Clyde Drexler and the crew. You go into the finals with Magic and the Lakers. You go into the finals with Karl Malone and Stockton. You go into the finals against Gary Payton and Sean Kemp. And Scottie Pippen has the temerity, the unmitigated gall, the blasphemy to sit up there and go like this. Well, you know what, they play in different eras, and we just have to look at it, and more responsibility was on LeBron James' shoulders.
Stephen A. Smith, brother, once again, I don't think that you truly understand what Scottie was saying. He was saying that you can't compare the two players because they do two different things for their team in two different eras. You know, I saw an interview with Wilt Chamberlain. It was an old interview that Wilt had when he was on the Conan O'Brien show, sometime in the mid-90s. And Conan O'Brien asked him about Michael Jordan. And Wilt Chamberlain stated that Michael Jordan was by far the best player playing at that time. He was an unbelievable player. But if he would have played back in the 60s, he would not have been allowed to do a lot of the fancy moves that he was allowed to do in the 90s. So that's my point. That's what I was trying to communicate to many of these brothers who are stuck in the 90s. Every generation says the same thing. Oh, he couldn't have done that back in our era. So in the same way that you watch a Steph Curry and you say, oh, well, he's not any better than Chris Jackson. Players from the 60s watch a Michael Jordan, or they'll see a Scottie Pippen or Karl Malone, and they'll say, yeah, he's great, but we would not have allowed him to do that stuff back in our era. That's just how it goes. And at the end of the day, everybody's full of shit. Because great players are going to be great in any era. It doesn't matter.
What are you smoking? Scottie Pippen, one of the greatest players as far as I'm concerned, two-way players. He defended all-time 50 greats. I loved having them on the show. It's all in fun, baby. Don't take it personal. I love me some Scottie Pippen.
Yeah, you better say that because Scottie will take it personal. Scottie be getting heated.
Pippen. But when it comes to this subject about Michael Jordan, I'm sitting there going like this. Did Michael Jordan not hug you enough?
Now you're starting to get somewhere, Stephen A. Smith. Now you're starting to get somewhere. Yes, there's still some resentment there from Scottie and many of Jordan's former teammates on the Bulls in regards to how they feel like they've been relegated. Their legacies have been diminished because they played with Jordan and they feel like he gets too much of the credit.
Did he not appreciate you enough? Is there something that's missing in terms of the love, the brotherhood, or something that tells us that, you know what, you just up in your feelings? Because I don't understand how you could bring up errors and think that that favors LeBron with the...
I don't think that Scottie was saying that his bringing up errors is in favor of LeBron. I actually think the opposite. But I do believe that you're onto something, Stephen A. Smith. You are onto something with your accusation that maybe some of Scottie's flip-flopping has to do with some inner turmoil, some inner resentment towards Jordan. You know, people continuously bring up how NBA TV should have Jordan and Barkley sit down, like how they had Isaiah Thomas and Magic Johnson. Maybe they should have Jordan and Scottie Pippen sit down and hash certain things out, because there's definitely something there. That's why I call it the older brother, little brother syndrome.
With this soft as cottonelle tissue era that we're living in. Unbelievable.
He's not saying the era favors LeBron. He's saying it's hard to judge because they played in different eras.
Thank you, sir.
But then why judge that, Max? Then why judge? Then why is he...
Because they keep asking him this question, Stephen A. Smith.
Why is he judging? Doesn't it sound like he's judging to you?
One of the observations he's making, which is true, is that Jordan was not asked to do as much as LeBron.
Absolutely, and that's definitely the truth. Michael Jordan is not asked to do as much as LeBron. But I think that people do a very poor job of following up on that sentiment. Was Michael Jordan not asked to do as much as LeBron because he couldn't do as much, or because he had a higher level understanding of how to utilize his team, because he had accepted basic basketball precepts on how to win from his time period playing in North Carolina with Dean Smith? See, even though Jordan was allowed to run amok in the NBA his first 5 years or so, it was easy for him to understand basketball precepts and basketball concepts when Phil Jackson and Tex Winter tried to implement them, because he had dealt with the same thing at North Carolina. LeBron James has never been told look, this is what you're going to do off the ball. You're going to run up and down the baseline and try to get open and set screens for your teammates, so on and so forth. Michael Jordan's able to do that. He's able to allow another player to handle the basketball, to distribute. LeBron had Kyrie Irving, and he would not allow Kyrie to play the point. To the point that Kyrie Irving had to prove that he was an actual point guard when he went to the Boston Celtics.
Now, that may also somewhat be a function of the era in which they play. But
let me ask you this question.
You and I both know Jordan's the greatest player ever lived.
I'm not debating
but you
that.
Can't admit
I'm
that
not
LeBron's
debating that. I got a question. I'm not debating that. What I'm asking you question is this question, Max. If you want to bring up era, how could you ignore the era and responsibility in the same question? It's not diametrically opposed. The point that I'm trying to make is the era was so tough. That in and of itself harbored a strong level of responsibility. Scottie Pippen knows basketball. He knows that.
Once again, Stephen A. Smith, Scottie Pippen is getting tired of being asked the same question. But the reason why he keeps getting asked the same question is because he keeps flip-flopping. So if he would have given one answer and stuck to it, they would stop asking him. And if he would have shown an eagerness to actually break down why he was going to create parameters like eras, then people will leave him alone. But he's not willing to do so because he's very wishy-washy due to, as you correctly ascertained, his personal issues with Michael Jordan.
Well, I would say, for example, when you talk about fouls, it was more physically taxing in Jordan's era in terms of how you might get roughed up. But I would say that LeBron gets more calls than Jordan. In fact, if you really want to look at it, LeBron suffers a little bit of what Shaq did, which is he's so big and strong, they let people get away with a little more on LeBron than they would on another player. And Jordan got a ton of calls.
Stop the question. Are you sitting here and saying that LeBron James has been exposed to the level of physicality that Michael Jordan was exposed to?
No, he's not saying that, Stephen A. Smith. All he's saying is that sometimes the referees may assume that LeBron James can deal with more physicality and deal with more punishment because he tends to be bigger than everyone else. That's really what he's saying.
No. It's not what I'm saying.
I just wanted to make sure. No, I'm not kidding. I had to ask.
You're talking about physical toughness. Look, if you rewind the clock in football, those guys may have been able to get away with more dirty tricks or more kind of brutality in a way. That doesn't mean
brutality is an appropriate word.
Yeah.
Brutality is see, hold on, Molly, before we go.
Game
see,
change.
this is the blasphemy in Max's word. This is the blasphemy when it comes to Max. Max Kellerman, put me up on that damn split screen so I can see Max Kellerman when I'm saying this, please. Max Kellerman, the boxing historian. I mean, a boxing historian, an elite boxing analyst. You cover a pugilistic sport and you're going to ignore the physicality that Michael Jordan has been subjected to because of this gibberish that Scottie Pippen is doing. Scottie Pippen is one of the elite players because in a physical era, he still stood out above the crowd. How can he look at himself, knowing how great he was, and not appreciate Michael Jordan as much as he should in comparison to the...
I'm not ignoring it. And Michael Jordan, by the way, played 82 games like every single year and played 40 minutes almost a game. I'm not ignoring it. It's not a question of who's tougher or even who's greater. Jordan, we agree about that. It's who had more to do. LeBron simply is asked to do more.
Absolutely. And let me say this also, just for brothers' consideration. Also understand that Stephen A. Smith speaks to Michael Jordan directly, and they're both members of the same fraternity, Omega Psi Phi. So that would explain a bit why Stephen A. Smith tends to get so emotional over this issue, because I don't think there's truly an emotional issue. I don't think that it's an insult to Michael Jordan necessarily that they're having this silly conversation. It is silly. We know that it's not realistic that LeBron James is on the level of Michael Jordan. And every once in a while I might use some hyperbole when making these videos on this topic, but it's not like it's totally beyond the pale that LeBron James be compared to Michael Jordan. People are going to do that because there are certain players that define an era, and oftentimes when people are raised or they grow or they mature during a certain time period where notable figures represent that time period, whether it's in sports or entertainment, they have an affinity for that person. So it's understandable. Cats who grew up in the late 90s into the 2000s, they love Kobe. People who grew up in the late 2000s into the 2010s, they love LeBron. That's why when we have these discussions, we have to utilize empirical data. We have to utilize things that are of substance. We have to be able to understand the difference and the disparity in time period, style of play, officiating, so on and so forth, pace. So Stephen A. Smith is getting very up in his feelings, as he would say. He's getting his panties all up in a bunch. It's very obvious to me that there are other reasons for that other than basketball.
And
Jordan was asked to do
got it.
less.
We got to leave it there. And those are two different things. He can be asked to do more, but Jordan can still be better. Got it. Stephen A. disagrees. We'll leave it there, guys.
But anyway, that's it on this issue. Unfortunately, they did not address the Wilt Chamberlain angle. Most likely because it would have added some complexities that maybe they did not want to introduce into this conversation. Wilt is certainly someone that can be considered the greatest player in NBA history. He's definitely the greatest athlete. And on the list of the most dominant, it's basically him and Shaq and everyone else. But anyway, peace.